Greetings from the Jazz Cloud. I'm Richie Zellin, and in this lesson I want to show you some proven strategies to learn and master any new scale you want to learn. So unless you're a seasoned jazz guitarist, stick with me because I'm going to share with you a foolproof, step-by-step procedure for maybe learning that missing scale you needed to solo over that new standard you just learned. Today I'd like to discuss one of the most important rudiments of learning jazz. And that, of course, is the process of learning those much needed scales that are going to provide the proper notes to solo over the music of your choice. However, before we can talk about mastering any given scale, we must be aware that on the guitar there are 7 available fingerings for any of these scales. Most proponents of the caged system only use 5 fingerings, but in reality there are 7. Now, I would never advise any student to learn all 7 of them from the get-go, not only because this can be very tedious, but also because you might never even have a need for all of them. So I advise that you learn and master them on a need-to-know basis. So step number 1, when learning a new scale, try to relate it to a different scale and fingering you already know. Of course, this won't apply if you don't know any scales, but I'm assuming here that, like most beginning jazz guitarists, you at a minimum know the minor pentatonic from playing blues and rock, and the conventional major scale or Ionian mode. Therefore, from here on, we will use these 2 as our reference scales. And what we want to do after you have the intervallic formula for your new scale, and yes, you do need some knowledge of basic theory, you need to see where it differs from any of the scales you already know and pick the one that differs the least for this coming procedure. Let me show you. So let's use the minor pentatonic in A to convert it to a Dorian. So as most of you know, a simple minor pentatonic in A would be root, flat 3, 4, the 5, the flatted 7, and then again 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 1, flat 3. Okay, so all we're going to do is add the 2 and a 6 to this same fingering, and presto, we'll have the Dorian. So here we go again, 1, adding the 2, flat 3, 4, 5, adding the 6, flat 7, 1, adding the 2, flat 3, adding the 4, 5, adding the 6, flat 7, 1, adding the 2. Next, let's convert the familiar major scale or Ionian mode to a Mixolydian. And let's do this again in the key of A. And we're going to use the fingering that starts with the middle finger on the 6th string because that's the one everybody seems to know. So to convert this to a Mixolydian, all we're going to do is bring each 7th degree down a half step, turn it into a flatted 7, and we'll have our dominant scale. So here we go again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And instead of going to this major 7th here, we're going to go to this minor 7th. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And instead of going to this major 7, we're going to slide back here. So Here's a suggested order to learn several scales you will employ when playing jazz. Again, let's start with the natural major scale or Ionian mode as our point of reference. Remember, the strategy is not to start from scratch, but instead to pick a scale that we already know and simply alter one or two notes to transform it into the new scale. So like I showed you previously, by lowering the 7 a half step on the major scale, we acquire the Mixolydian. Now, by simply lowering the 3rd a half step on the Mixolydian, we acquire the Dorian. Now, you have the 3 scales to play over the most common progression in jazz, the 2-5-1. By lowering the 6 on the Dorian a half step, we acquire the Aeolian or natural minor. By lowering the 2 and the 5 a half step on the Aeolian, we acquire the Locrian. Now you have the most frequently used modes derived from the major scale. The next step I suggest would be to lower the 3rd on the major scale, which would result in the melodic minor. And you can then use this as a starting point to derive all the melodic minor modes you need by just altering a note or two where needed. Once you have finally gotten the fingering down for the new scale, you want to further prep it for the way it will be used. And 2 out of 3 players fail to take this step into consideration. That is, they just practice the new scale how they initially learned it. Always starting on the root available on the lowest string. Somehow they think that by doing this daily, the scale will be mastered. Well, that's far from it. And when I stop a student who has practiced in this manner and say to him or her, now play the scale descending from the highest available note on the 1st string, without first having to ascend from the lowest note in order to find the highest note, what do you think happens? They freeze. And it's even worse if I ask them to start somewhere in the middle of the scale, say on the 3rd string. Now think about this for a moment. How many jazz guitar solos can you recall that start on the root of a scale located on the 6th or 5th string? It's a very dark and low register and doesn't really capture the listener's attention, not to mention that the root, which is already being played by the bass player, is probably the least interesting note to start with. So this brings us to step 2. Practice the scale descending from its highest available note, starting on the 1st string. And from here on, we will use the Mixolydian that we previously went over for all of our examples. Once you are a little more familiar with the ins and outs of the new scale, you are ready for step number 3. Isolate and practice only the chord arpeggio notes. You know, not every note in a scale can be held indefinitely during a solo. Some will actually clash with the underlying chord, which in turn is extracted from the scale at hand. So if we want to play it safe and know where our safe landing points, or what we call resolution tones, are located, we must extract and practice only the notes that make up the derived chord arpeggio. And these are always going to be the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of the scale. Yes, it's very important that we learn the scale, not always having to start on the lowest string, but instead on the highest one, because that's how we're going to use it most of the time. So 1, flat 7, we're going to skip the 6, 5, we're going to skip the 4, playing the 3, 1, we skip the 2, and again, flat 7, 5, 3, 1. And ascending. This next practice tip is sure to solidify your mastery of where every note in the arpeggio and scale is located so you can be ready to get creative with it. So step number 4, practice the arpeggio and scale in 4-note segments, ascending and descending, starting from each chord tone. So 1, flat 7, 5, 3, that's the first segment. And then we're going to do flat 7, 5, 3, 1, and then 5, 3, 1, flat 7, and then 3, 1, flat 7, 5, then 1, flat 7, 5, 3, then flat 7, 5, 3, 1. So and then we practice ascending. 1, 3, 5, flat 7, you know. And then 3, 5, 7, 1, 5, 7, 1, 3, flat 7, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and finally 3, 5, 7, 1. So if we go back, and you can try playing some blues with it. You might need at least another fingering, but that's a good way to combine all the different segments and not always start from the same place. You know, something like. Etc., etc. You get the idea? Okay, so the next step is to take the arpeggio, the 4-note segment, and replace one of the chord tones with a passing tone from the scale. So now you will only have 3 chord tones and a passing tone. And let's start again from the first string. And this time I'm going to use the 1, the flat 7, and the 5 on this first one. 1, flat 7, and I'm going to insert the 6, 5. And now we go flat 7, 6, 5, 3. Now 5, 3, and I'm going to insert the 2, 1. Now 3, 2, 1, flat 7. How about 1, flat 7, insert the 6, 5, flat 7, 6, 5, 3, and finally 5, 3, 2, 1. This is what we call permutations, and I have a great video I recommend you watch all about permutations. Okay, then we're going to go up. We're going to ascend. I'm going to insert the 2, 3, 5. Now 3, 5, 6, flat 7, 5, 6, flat 7, 1, flat 7, 1, 2, 3, and 1, inserting the 2, 3, 5, 3, 5, inserting the 6, flat 7, and 5, inserting the 6, flat 7, 1. So the whole thing. And what I suggest you do if you're going to practice over some blues is mix the previous 4-note segments with just the arpeggio with the ones we just did, including one passing tone. So something like... Okay, it's very simple, very, very diatonic, but it's a great and fun way to really get these down in a more creative way. So that concludes the 4 steps I recommend to learn and master any new scale. Just remember that eventually you should do this for each new fingering you learn for the new scale. But don't get overwhelmed. There is lots of music you can play with just 2 or 3 fingerings. So I hope this lesson has been helpful. As usual, I appreciate your comments, likes, and welcome any questions you might have. What is the meaning of life? Where do babies come from? And all those mysteries that have kept you up at night. If you enjoyed this lesson and haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and don't forget to click on the notification bell icon so you won't miss any of my upcoming lessons. Meanwhile, here is another lesson I think you should check out. Hasta la vista.